Okay, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar with myself, John Cooper, and today we have a very special guest. We have Eben Alexander. Eben was an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years, including 15 years at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Children's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School in Boston. He has a passionate interest in physics and cosmology. He is the author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe. His website is ebenalexander.com, and we're going to be speaking about predominantly his book, The Proof of Heaven. So, Eben, welcome to the show.
Well, John, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
No, great to have you here. I was actually recommended your book by a good friend of mine, and it had a very strong impact on their life. And so I was very keen to read about it. And we've actually just had a guest on who's a neuroscientist called Ian McGilchrist, who talks about the divided brain. So we're kind of on that subject at the moment. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Brilliant man. I love his writing. Yeah, he's done a great job.
He spent 20 years writing that book. So
wow. Well, it shows because it's masterfully written. So.
Yeah, I thought so as well. Very well written. And he even writes it in a very left and right brain style in the book, which I thought was very contextualized. But I want to talk about your book because I think your story is absolutely fascinating. You've also come from a scientific background. You reference yourself as a sort of a skeptical, how would you put it, a skeptical secular scientist and neuroscientist. Would you mind, in your own words, so I don't put any words in your mouth, because you're very eloquent and beautiful with your words as you've written the book, would you mind giving us a little bit of a background to the story again so our audience can get a taste of it?
Certainly. I think it's important to point out that before my coma, I'd spent 54 years of my life honing a very scientific worldview. And I also was influenced by a father who was very scientific, and yet he was very religious. He was a neurosurgeon, a globally renowned neurosurgeon, but for him, his science never conflicted with his belief in prayer and God. Now, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like many of that generation, I knew early in my life that science is absolutely the pathway to truth. And I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. But I also have witnessed aspects of the universe that were far more than I ever had to deal with before. And of course, my experience just mirrors what millions of others have reported. So it really is time for science to take all this seriously. Now, from my own awakening, it happened early in the morning of November 10th, 2008, that I woke up with horrific back pain, soon a headache beyond description, grand mal seizures, deep into coma. I was hauled off to the hospital at that point, a hospital where I had worked as a neurosurgeon for more than 2 years. And they realized very quickly how sick I was, suspected I had bacterial meningitis, and lumbar puncture was done, needle in my back into the fluid space around brain and spinal cord. And out came thick white pus under pressure. Now, recently there's been a medical report on my medical records that goes far beyond proof of heaven in documenting just how sick I was and just how miraculous that recovery is. And people who want to look at that medical report can go to ebenalexander.com, look on my blog posting of September 2018, and in the third paragraph, you'll find a link directly to the case report. But the case report, in fact, was by 3 physicians astonished by my recovery, but not involved in my care. And in fact, in explaining to the peer review editors how this could happen, because it doesn't look like this is a medical record of anybody who could have a complete recovery, they explained that it was really the content, the spiritual content of my near-death experience that led to such a profound, miraculous recovery. I think that's important for people to understand. This is not just some little case of meningitis. This is a horrific, should have killed me case. Now, to get briefly into what happened to me deep in that coma, important to point out, first of all, that one atypical feature of my near-death experience is the fact that I was amnesic. I had no memory. I had no words or language, no knowledge of Earth or this universe, absolutely zero recollection of Eben Alexander's personal life or religious beliefs or scientific knowledge. Every bit of that was eliminated, giving me an empty slate. And I explain in the books exactly what the import of all that is. But first of all, when I first came out of coma, and my mind was, and my brain was really wrecked. In fact, when I first woke up from coma, the only thing I remembered was where I had just been. This extraordinary journey that I'll share briefly in a few minutes. But the important thing is words and language came back very rapidly, literally within a few hours of when I first gained conscious awareness in that ICU bed. Personal memories, childhood memories came back over a few weeks, but in fact, everything came back over 8 weeks. That's the real mystery here, is how could I have memories come back to me that were so, that were even clearer and more complete after 8 weeks of recovery post-coma than they had been before coma. I mean, it's really astonishing. But as we discuss in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, memory is not even stored in the brain. I mean, that's another topic that we'll get into probably a little bit later. But the bottom line is, to me, it was an astonishing process to go through this. But the important thing is to clarify what I knew when I first woke up in that ICU bed after 7 days in coma. And what I remembered was a journey that began in a very coarse, primitive, subterranean realm that I call the earthworm's eye view. And I think that was the best, consciousness that my physical brain could muster when all 8 lobes of my brain, my neocortex, were under severe onslaught from E. coli meningitis. And in fact, the CT and MRI scans showed all 8 lobes of the brain affected. My neurologic exams made it very clear that I had horrific damage to my neocortex. Even my brainstem was badly damaged on day 1. And all of that just got worse on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics, which is why on day 7, the doctors were recommending, they said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2%. And if I was in that 2% survival category, that did not translate into any chance for recovery. So in fact, all the doctors involved in my care, and there were many up and down the East Coast of the US who were consulting on it, they had no idea how I came back from this and then had a full recovery. But getting back into the deep mystery that earthworm's eye view was where it all started. I'm sure I had no memory moment to moment of things, and that's why it seemed to last forever, but it didn't, because there came this slowly spinning white light that was associated with a perfect musical melody. And that's very important, because the notes of that melody, by remembering them, it enabled me to re-enter this portal several times during my NDE. Now, where that led was up into a brilliant, ultra-real gateway valley, far more real than this world. People often think that a near-death experience is kind of murky and dreamlike. No, this is murky and dreamlike compared to that reality, which is so astonishing. And more than 50% of NDEers are really stricken with that amazing kind of ultra-reality and meaningfulness. That's why NDEs can be remembered, half a century later in great detail, is because they are such impressive experiences. They completely outdo everything else in our lives in terms of important events. Now, in that Gateway Valley, there were many Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing among millions of butterflies that were spiraling in these vast formations above a beautiful meadow. And this meadow was just lush with life. There were no signs of any kind of death or decay anywhere. In fact, all the plant life was very dynamically, richly growing and flourishing and fertile. Flowers, buds on trees, everything, just an amazing, alive reality. And there were thousands of beings in that valley. In my early writings in the weeks after coma, I said that they were souls between lives, and I described them as dressed in very simple but very colorful garb. And there was tremendous festivity in this valley. Lots of joy and merriment. There were children playing, dogs jumping, just incredible mirth and festivity, all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs, pure spiritual golden orbs, leaving sparkling golden trails against a blue-black velvety sky, with the entire scene lit with billowing clouds of pure color. And what I came to call those beautiful swooping orbs above that were emanating these chants and anthems and hymns that would thunder through me. In my early writings, I called them Angelic Choirs. And that's part of the tremendous magic. And on that butterfly wing, I remember vividly the first experience, given that, remember, I had zero coming into this, no memory, no preconceptions, no religious beliefs, nothing. And that's why I then experienced my first perception of the divine, of the God force, of pure love, of healing wholeness, as this soft summer breeze that blew through the scene and essentially changed everything. Now, even though the details of the scene remain the same, that breeze was my awareness of the breath of God, as I called it in my early writings. And that's what enlivened the entire scene. And that's when I realized that divine force of love was something that was not only present in the spiritual realm, but went down below into that four-dimensional space-time, that dense material realm that was underneath all of this. And I could witness every bit of that. And the most beautiful thing about being on this butterfly wing with this spectacular swooping orbs of angelic choirs and the beautiful valley below was that I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, broad smile, high forehead, soft brown hair framing her absolutely beautiful face. She never said a word to me. She never had to. Her thoughts, her emotional truth came into my awareness telepathically. And it was, to me, the most profound message of the entire journey. And certainly the one that I was to bring back to this world, because it's for all souls. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of. And I cannot tell you how refreshing and reassuring and invigorating that message was in this setting. And that message came directly from her awareness. And that was when I then realized that the angelic choirs above were providing yet another musical portal. I'm trusting that your listeners realize that in those realms, one of the reasons people say near-death experiences are ineffable, indescribable, our language just doesn't do them justice, is because our modes of knowing in that realm are far richer than in this world. In this world, sounds, are kind of filtered by ears, and then the brain does a lot of additional filtering. Visual information is filtered through the eyes and again through the brain. And it's all constricted down into this very limited form of conscious awareness. Over there, no, our modes of knowing are far grander. It's what I call knowledge through identification, where we become huge swathes of the scene around us. And for example, the life review, which is commonly described by near-death experiencers, more than 50% of NDEs over all of history have life reviews, very profound. But the interesting thing about them is when you go through a life review, you don't re-experience things from your point of view, your perspective, but actually from the emotional perspective of those around you and how they were impacted by your thoughts and actions. So this is a form of knowledge by identification, becoming kind of others in this bigger scheme as part of our lessons of learning and teaching the deep lessons of those spiritual realms. And so the life review is a beautiful example of that kind of thing. Now, I did not have a life review in the classic sense because of my amnesia. There was no way for me to compare things, but I did see life reviews in very profound fashion in this vision during this journey. And it had to do, one was a vision of what I like to kind of liken to Indra's net, which is an idea from Eastern spiritual traditions of interwoven threads. And this is where I saw reincarnation and life reviews as so crucial at leading towards the evolution of all consciousness, because of the role they play in individual soul journeys towards this omega point that I believe we are all headed to. So at any rate, in my journey, those angelic choirs in the Gateway Valley provided yet a portal to higher and higher levels. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down. Then all of that spiritual realm of the Gateway Valley, including a completely different layering of causality, important in an understanding of reincarnation, given that our relationships to others are the reason the whole universe exists. And what we learn and grow from in those relationships is so important. And people often worry, well, reincarnation, what if my loved one has reincarnated before I pass over, so they're not there to welcome me? Well, it's that whole different ordering of causality in the spiritual realm that I call deep time. It's the same thing that allows near-death life reviews to be so completely detailed. You relive those instances almost like it's all happening simultaneously, but each one is very detailed. That kind of thing can happen in the realm of deep time. Very important to get that, because you never have to worry that a loved one would reincarnate too early to be there for you.
Yeah,
At any rate,
yeah.
in this journey, I then ascended into what I call the core, infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the divine and healing love of that God force. And of course, that's the same thing that near-death experiencers have described by the millions over thousands of years from all cultures, independent of any religious beliefs. And that's where I think, the notion of love and kindness, compassion, of our connection with others, essentially the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, which is featured in some form in every faith, every religious belief system on earth, and even some non-religious belief systems, moral systems that talk about treating others as you would like to be treated. That is written into the fabric of the universe at the level of the life review. Very important to stress that. Now, in that core realm, that is as far from this earthly world as possible, and there's really no way to put into words what that's like. I tried to do it in the book. About the best kind of analogy I can use, it's like standing on the edge of a black hole, if you can imagine that, where you have one foot inside the event horizon where time has stopped and eternity and infinity come together, and the other foot is still out there in the world where you're just beginning to parcel out from that incredibly rich kind of spiritual God healing source of all that is, of our very conscious awareness. And then it starts to break out into these spiritual levels and then all the way down to this densest level here. Well, in that core realm, I was told, we'll teach you many things, but you're not here to stay. And in fact, what would happen is I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. And it seemed to happen very spontaneously. And it happened several times. And I had to then remember the musical notes to allow me to conjure up the portal up into the Gateway Valley. And then the Angelic Choirs provided the musical portal up into the higher and higher levels, into the core realm again and again. But like they said, I wasn't there to stay. And there came a time when remembering the notes of the musical melody no longer elevated me up out of that earthworm eye view. And to say I was sad or blue at that point would be a vast understatement, but I also knew by that point I could trust in the universe. Trust is a very important thing to gain here, that we will be taken care of. And then that is when I saw the thousands of beings around me going off into the distance and heads bowed and many of them with their hands up like that, this murmuring energy. I couldn't understand any of the murmurings because my language was still not there, and yet I knew that they were giving me the same gift that I'd experienced in those higher spiritual realms before, of connection, of love, of being home. And I saw all that when I wrote it all up weeks later as prayer and the power of prayer. Prayer gets in no matter what level the soul is at in the journey, even if it has permanently left the body. So prayer is a beautiful way to continue communication. And then it was where I saw the 6 faces that were described at the very end of my journey. They were very important because they provided time anchors. 5 of them were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours I was in coma, which helped to show that the original journey, the vast spiritual journey I described in Proof of Heaven, which seemed to me to last for months or years, had to be compressed to within 5 Earth days, days 1 through 5 of my coma. The book explains why it's days 1 through 5 and not days 1 through 7. But the important point is that it was soon thereafter that I started coming back to this world, because the last face I saw in that group was of my 10-year-old son, Bond. Now, I didn't know who it was at the time. I had no idea I had a, quote, son, because that part of my kind of mind and conscious awareness had not yet returned to me. But what happened was that was Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. That's when the doctors held the family conference saying it was time to stop the 3 antibiotics, that I was still on the ventilator, was not showing any real positive signs neurologically of any chance of recovery. And they said, let nature take its course. 2% chance of survival, but all that means is you'll get to a nursing home, spend months there, and finally die. They saw no chance for recovery. And that's when I came back to this world. But important to point out, my family, even though they were, of course, ecstatic to see me starting to come back, they were horrified by what they then saw, because I spent 36 hours in and out of a crazy, paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare. And I compare all of that psychotic ICU psychosis, which seemed more real than a normal dream, but nowhere near the ultra reality of the deep coma experience. And important to point out is when I look back on it now, those memories of the deep coma experience are as rich and profound and detailed and meaningful as if they just happened yesterday. Mm-hmm. Whereas the ICU psychotic stuff that happened in the 36 hours after I was taken after the ventilator, that stuff faded within weeks. I'm glad I wrote it all down, because otherwise I would have very little memory of it. And that says a lot about NDE memories. There have been several scientific papers written to point out that NDE memories in many ways are treated even more powerfully by mind and brain than memories of pretty astonishing events in real life. NDEs are not hallucinations. That's the most important thing to know. They are not dreams or confabulations. They actually are showing us something very profound about the nature of reality and of our existence. And this is where the ensuing 11 years have been so important, because there is a valid scientific way to explain all of this, but it has to do with a complete revolution in our scientific understanding of the nature of the universe and of humanity's place in it.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing all that. There's so many questions I have. I've got the infinite amount of questions I want to ask you about all that. In that state, you started off in that primordial state, the earthworm's view. And then you talk about you were in a state of desperation. I remember you saying it felt horrible. It was almost the clanking noises, almost felt slightly hellish, I think. It was almost that kind of, and that feeling of, oh my God, am I stuck here forever? And then there was almost like the intention you set was what called down the angelic beings, and they brought you up into those higher realms. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Well, you do. I'll tell you one interesting point I'd like to clarify, though, is your implication there is that my free will as a soul brought this all on. I just have to confess, at the early stages of the journey, I did not feel like any aspect of me was really causing it. Even though I came to realize the power of a notion of higher soul that really overlaps with all higher souls and with that God force. And yet, no, for much of this journey, it was like I was being shown so many things. I was along for the ride. It was a demonstration, even though I know that at some level kind of my higher soul was involved in orchestrating it all. My memory of it, I guess that's just my kind of ego memory, and my memory is Eben Alexander, but is really one of just being grateful and trusting that all of this was presented to me, and not necessarily that certainly from an egoic perspective that I had any kind of free will determination of how it unfolded. Okay. But it's important to point out that all you have to do is believe and trust in the possibility of this loving connection with the universe, and it opens up very naturally. And that's what happened for me.
And so at that point, you're just a speck of awareness, is that right? Or would you say that you were, or did you feel as though you were the entire landscape, if you like, at one with, or both?
Well, you know, at the deepest level, for example, in the core realm, there were times, just as I was saying, our language is not very good at describing any of this, but there were times where I felt that our conscious awareness is a very direct and absolute connection with that infinitely creative God force. So in other words, it was a very profound sense of how, you know, something that we as all humans share, and it's something we all have, is this conscious awareness. But in many ways, on that kind of a deep journey, that awareness overlaps so intrinsically with the creative force that we come to realize that we're co-creative of our future and of our lives and of our understanding of all this with that God force. So, you know, in my Methodist upbringing, there's no way you would be talking about oneness with God as if there was some kind of equivalence there. And yet, what I think so many near-death experiencers do explain is this sense of becoming one with God, of bathing in that ocean of love, of pure oneness, and knowing that we're always in that spiritual home. And that's one of the things that is so comforting about a near-death experience.
Because I've gone through certain experiences myself. I can't compare it to that, but I have done psychedelics, I have done ayahuasca, and I've had experiences where time doesn't exist. I could have been stuck like that for a minute or a lifetime, or even like, you know, eternity. I don't know. That's kind of the feeling. So I can relate to that in a way.
Well, it's a very good thing to point out, but it has to do with the fact that time, as we see Earth time unfolding, it's very much bound to consciousness.
Right.
So in other words, it's a creation of consciousness itself, not something that consciousness lives in. But that's why when we explore and get deeply into consciousness, like on an ayahuasca journey or on a near-death experience or in deep meditation, I'm a huge fan of meditation for doing this. But we basically escape the shackles of space and time. It's very, and that's why a life review can be so profoundly impressive, because they're not vague sepia-tinted memories. These are sharp, crisp, all-encompassing memories of events. And you have a whole lifetime's worth that happen like that in some cases, for example, of cardiac arrest. So it's really a different kind of understanding of time flow and our consciousness and its relationship to time flow. But you're making a very good point there about some of the similarities with psychedelic experiences and NDEs, even though I will tell you that having experienced both, NDE is a far more profound, life-changing, kind of earth-shattering reality, whereas they're like looking out the bay window in the penthouse suite, and seeing the whole world spread out before you, whereas the psychedelic drugs are like looking through a tiny little keyhole and glimpsing that same reality, but they're not the same. Don't think that an NDE is as limited as an ayahuasca or DMT or LSD or psilocybin experience.
I can believe you on that, especially you were describing, I think in the book, it's like being stuck in a closet and thinking that's all there is, compared to the whole world that we live in. So in that state, at that point, you had no memory of being Eben, having the meningitis, being in the hospital at all. That has evaporated, right? You were totally immersed and become this new reality, right? I can totally relate to that, even in my psychedelic experience. And then in that reality, with there being no time, would you say that that was a universal reality that we all dissolve back into after our human incarnations end? Or would you say that was a personal reality for you and everyone has their own personal, similar reality that you experience, but their own variation of that? Or would you say that we all kind of go back into that universal reality, but have different perspectives of it?
Excellent question. One of the crucial things to point out here is the near-death experience in every single case is designed for the growth, the teaching and learning of the soul involved in that experience. And so our prior beliefs may figure into how we describe it, how we interpret it, but the content is dependent on that realm. And when you study these things in large numbers, NDEs, you find that there are a tremendous amount of commonalities, especially about kind of the emotional engagement and the power of learning and teaching that's involved. And people often describe it somewhat differently. It's where some of the skeptics get horribly misled about this. Because, for example, to compare to my case, if everybody is not on a butterfly wing, with a beautiful woman, then it's not the same territory. Well, I will invite you to notice that if we had a group of, say, 15 people, and we teleported all of them to Paris, kind of randomly sprinkled them down into Paris, and left them there 12 hours to journey about, and then brought them all back to one place, they would all have very, very different stories to tell that would reflect not only where they landed and who they interacted with, but also a lot about their state kind of going into it, who they were before. So don't be surprised that the stories can sound somewhat different. When you study them in detail, though, it's astonishing how the similarities are there, in spite of all the wide variety of differences, say, in medical situation that drive people into NDEs. Also important to point out, there's a huge category of what are called shared death experiences, which are identical to near-death experiences in quality, but they happen in people who are normally physiologically normal. And the typical setting for a shared death experience is, for example, somebody standing at the bedside of a loved one who's dying, or they could be 1,000 miles away and have a loved one who's dying. But the reality is that when the soul leaves the departing soul, often it will take along the soul of the bystander. And the bystander soul can even go along and witness a full-blown life review. And I've heard many of those cases from people who had never heard of them before, but they'd had one. And after I give a talk, they'd come up to me afterwards and say, well, I've never had an NDE, but this is what happened when my mother died, or something like that. And it's shocking to hear these extraordinary tales coming from people who are completely normal physiologically. It's one of the reasons why the materialist pseudo-explanations for NDEs having to do with decreased oxygen tension or increased CO2 are nonsense. They have nothing to do with anything, because shared death experiences don't involve any of those medical factors at all, and yet people describe the same things. But the interesting thing are those kind of commonalities of kind of the ambience of the level. So it's important to remember that these are always tailored for the individual, but they have enough commonality when you study them to show that they're indicating a very real realm. In fact, one that seems to the participant much more real, vivid, alive, and meaningful than this world.
Yeah.
And that's why NDEs must be taken very seriously, because they're teaching us something profound about our existence and about the nature of reality. But when you cut right to the chase, the ultimate deep and profound lesson of the near-death experience community is simply that we are here to love each other unconditionally, show kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, gratitude, and when necessary, forgiveness. Those are the cardinal messages coming from NDEs, and it's high time that this world woke up to that reality, and that's how we started behaving. We are not separate from each other. This revolution in consciousness in the scientific world is about the oneness of consciousness, about the overlap. And so if we hurt another, we're hurting ourselves. And that's where I think that golden rule is written into the fabric of the universe, and it's high time we brought it into the way we live our lives in this world.
Yeah, it's a great message. So you do believe that there's a metaphorical Paris that we all go into, if you like, if you want to use your metaphor there. There is one metaphorical pool of reality that we all dissolve back into, just to summarize there. It's not like we all have our separate...
I believe that's very much the case. Now, you have to be very open-minded about what that is, because it's astonishing. That's why people, when they come back to this world, often they won't talk about an NDE. They wonder if they went crazy. And they're very worried that if they share it with people, that they'll be considered crazy. And that's, I hope, proof of heaven. Thankfully, it struck a resonant chord with people. In fact, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 2 years. It's been 42 weeks at the #1 position on the New York Times list. It's been published in 42 countries around the world. So it really resonated with people. And I believe that's because it woke a memory in them. Something that we discuss, especially in the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is all of the evidence for reincarnation. You cannot understand any of this revolution in consciousness if you subscribe to the belief that we have one incarnation, then eternal, heaven, hell, or nothing. Because reincarnation is a crucial aspect of understanding this kind of soul journey and this role of consciousness in the world today. So there's a tremendous revolution. It's all really based in the science. That's why, we've had 5,000 years for, the scenario where various prophets and mystics would have these incredible visions of the universe beyond the simple physical realm, bring it back to this world, and then try to codify it in religious teachings. And then occasionally people would experience it in prayer and in spontaneous epiphanies. But, in the late 1960s, doctors developed techniques of cardiac resuscitation. And so the universe was getting a little tired of that old system of prophets, mystics, religious, and do we believe it or not? And that's why the near-death experience community was really enlivened tremendously 6 decades ago with cardiac resuscitation. We've now brought back tens of millions of souls who have been to the other side, glimpse that, and come back to tell and share the tale. That is no accident. That is because this awakening is profound, and it's absolutely essential for the survival of mankind and for life on this planet, for us to wake up and take proper stewardship of this planet and start taking care of ourselves and each other. No more of this pretending that we're separate from each other, because we're really all in this together, and that will make us far stronger.
Absolutely, that sounds what a fantastic poetic message as well. Would you say in that? Okay, so I had this question. You were technically, I know you had, you were in a coma, but you weren't actually officially dead, right? You hadn't died, but you can confidently say that that experience that you had, that reality that you were in, would be the same when you actually your body physically dies. And would you be able to maybe elaborate on how you can be confident in that, or would you say that it's only confident in near-death experiences, but once that person's still alive, that would make sense?
Well, you raised some very interesting questions, and it's important to point out to the non-scientific viewers here. One reason the scientific community has really embraced and taken my story on as being so important has to do with the documented damage to my neocortex. And that case report in September of 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases makes that crystal clear. The evidence for damage was so extensive, especially given the CT and MRI scans that showed all 8 lobes of my brain affected, that and full thickness of effect, because there was swelling at the gray-white junction throughout my brain. And that should not have allowed for any kind of robust, enhanced kind of conscious awareness, given everything that neuroscience postulates about how the brain would create consciousness and how the neocortex would serve as kind of the most powerful calculator and therefore responsible for all the details of conscious awareness. So when we use meningitis to take my entire neocortex out of the picture, that does something very amazing in terms of the doors it opens for understanding. So yes, I believe this gave me a beautiful view of what it's like when your soul and conscious awareness depart your brain. Even though I must confess that I think that the lessons of an NDE at that point in my lifetime in many ways were pertinent to help me growing at that point in my lifetime. So I don't expect to see a complete duplication of the very same lessons when I leave this physical world once and for all, but I suspect it'll simply be an expansion of all of that.
Right.
For one thing, given the amnesia, and the amnesia was very important for some of the lessons that I ended up learning from this. And given the fact I don't expect that amnesia will be a huge part of my next journey into this, although we'll have to wait and see. But many of the NDEs, in fact, the majority of them, come from cardiac arrest patients who might have no blood flow to the brain for several minutes. And yes, you have cardiac arrest, and within 10 to 20 seconds, you go unconscious, and then your brain waves go flat very quickly. So the neocortex gets inactive very rapidly. But the important thing is if you restore blood flow, ideally within 4 minutes, but 5, 6, 8, 20 minutes can also work, but it does entail more damage. That restoration of blood flow, you don't expect a huge amount of brain damage, whereas the case report makes it very clear on my case that my brain was horribly damaged and with really no chance of recovery given everything we know about modern Western medical knowledge of meningoencephalitis, of gram-negative bacteria and how destructive they are to the brain. I mean, the very fact that I can sit here and put 2 words together is in many ways a miraculous result given what happened. And that's made very clear in that case report. They go far beyond what I did, because Proof of Heaven was really based on kind of my review of my medical records, discussing it with my colleagues and trying to come to an understanding, whereas the 3 doctors who wrote that case report spent about 2 years going deeply into all the medical details of my case and then discussing it broadly, submitted it to several journals, getting tremendous peer review feedback to help them make it a much stronger article, and that's what it is. But one of the strongest conclusions, as they said, is that the best way to explain my miraculous recovery is because of the spiritual content of the near-death experience. And they knew of other cases like mine. For example, Anita Morjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me, had an advanced lymphoma, was deathly ill from that, deep in coma, taken into a Hong Kong hospital in February, I think it was 2006, and then ended up having this incredible recovery where her lymphoma just vanished because she had the spiritual NDE to help her do that. Likewise, Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon, wrote a book called To Heaven and Back, kayaking accident in Chile where she was underwater in a warm water drowning for more than 30 minutes. And anybody, who's witnessed drownings realize, no, you don't come back from that unscathed. And yet she ended up having a perfect recovery from it, went back to orthopedic surgery, but also wrote books, and I've presented with her several times. Another case that the UVA group was knew of, an NDE with profound healing. This is why it's so important for all of us to pay attention to these, because what they do is they take the phenomenon, placebo effect, which has been known and acknowledged in medicine for thousands of years, although it's been used heavily in the last 6 decades as the gold standard for comparing any new medical and many surgical procedures. The placebo-controlled trial. It's simply an acknowledgement that our beliefs can have tremendous power in our healing. In many ways, you can say that modern education in medical schools is a bit schizophrenic, because on the one hand, it's very materialist science, physics, chemistry, biology, straight down the materialist line. But there's also this kind of incredible awakening to kind of the greater power of belief to heal. And if it has such a profound effect in our healing that it can eradicate diseases that Western medicine really doesn't have other ways to manage through physical material means, then that just shows us the power of our beliefs. And it's important for us to realize that the vast majority of beliefs in our culture are falsely limiting. And that's where this revolution in conscious awareness and a whole different mode of seeing our free will and our potentials for human influence on our evolving reality are so crucial.
Thank you, Eben, for that. I wanted to ask the soul. Okay, so what's your concept of the soul, and how would you explain it? Maybe this is something that can't be explained to the human intelligence, conscious awareness, because it's something that can only be really conceptualized in that realm, let's say. But if you could use that, could you say where it is? Is it our whole body? Is it in the heart chakra? How would you go about trying to, if we could, explain where and what the soul is and where it's sort of situated?
Well, first of all, I would say the soul is not contained within the body or brain. All of physical reality, and that includes body and brain, are actually generated from the level of consciousness and soul. Very important thing to understand. The next major point, do not be fooled into believing that you are your thoughts, that thoughts and stream of memories, your conscious awareness running through your head. I love how Michael Singer puts it in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls that little voice in the head your annoying roommate. That is the best way to look at it. Do not start thinking your soul identifies with that little voice in your head. And this is where it gets far more kind of exciting. The soul is the essence of us. And in many ways, the ego is there to kind of show kind of both sides of kind of how a soul could evolve. But it's the choices that are made by the ego that help the soul to nudge kind of growth and understanding along this pathway. So the soul is something far grander than that. The soul is not limited to one physical body and one physical lifetime. The soul is the much grander aspect of us. The most interesting concept here, though, is we can connect with that very readily through prayer and meditation. When you realize the modern scientific version of this, given that we have to let go of the notion brain creates consciousness, because we know that's false. That has been disproven. That has nothing to do with reality. And it has that statement has a tremendous amount to do with knowledge of the reality of things like non-local consciousness, telepathy, precognition, the ability to know the future, psychokinesis, the ability some people have to manipulate physical matter with their mind, medicine, telehealing, our ability to influence health at a distance through prayer and through other means of energy healing, things like that. These are all examples of kind of the much greater implications of a non-local conscious awareness, which is what we truly are.
And we've always got that. Sorry, Eben, to interject, but we have that soul from the moment of conception, right? We are that.
Absolutely.
Soul. Yeah.
Well, in fact, it goes before that, because in many ways, I believe that our journeys here on Earth are selected in advance kind of by our higher soul and soul group. And what they're actually doing is lining up hardships. That's the key thing to get here. The hardships in life are gifts. They are stepping stones that mark a pathway forward. And it's how our free will responds to those challenges in life, illness, injury, what have you. That is what allows for soul growth. And the more we can recover a sense of oneness and connection with the universe, oneness and connection with others, and this, of course, includes who you might see as your, quote, enemy. I know after my coma, I came back realizing that some who I might have considered my enemy or my nemesis before my coma were actually near and dear soul mates. And it just turns out that the lessons we were trying to teach each other and learn from each other were so deep and profound that they seemed to be a challenge in the moment. And yet the growth that occurred through that hardship often is well worth, the price of admission. So I believe that we really select a lot of those hardships. I've come to realize, things in my life. For example, I stopped drinking alcohol in 1991. My family and I came to realize that basically I was alcoholic. And that's, it was one of the greatest gifts of my life to do that. Not the interesting thing looking back on it was not the getting rid of alcohol that was the gift. It was being born alcoholic in the first place, because that allowed for some very profound soul growth. And of course, I look back on my meningitis. Many people would say going into meningitis like that and having your family go through that would be a horrific thing to go through. Yes, it was in the moment. But of course, in looking back on it, it was all a tremendous gift. Now, you might argue, well, if I died from it, would I have gotten any of the lessons? I believe fully, based on what I saw, yes, I would have gotten a different set of lessons. But by coming back to this world, I had an even more profound set of lessons to share with this world. It's important to remember that all of this is part of a beautiful plan. And the more that we can recover a sense, even in the face of challenges, hardships, in the world of addiction and alcoholism, you talk about the gift of desperation. People's lives get so bad that they either go on to die or they bounce off the bottom, and they use the energy of that dark night of the soul to come back up and to use it. And that, in many ways, is what I've been able to do through these challenges and hardships in my life. And I believe for all of us, these are opportunities for growth. But the important thing to remember is that each and every one of us is a very crucial and dear child of the universe, here for an important purpose, to manifest love and kindness, compassion for ourselves and for others. When I came back from that coma journey, I realized that the vast majority of the world's problems were because we don't love ourselves enough. Yes, forget loving our neighbor or our enemy. Most of the hardships we kind of bring on ourselves, and that certainly is made very apparent in the world of alcoholism and addiction. And addiction goes far beyond just drugs. Sex addiction, love addiction, addiction to work, exercise. Addiction can take many different roles, but it's always something that steals your life away from your soul growth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's important to have a much more wholesome relationship with yourself, with your higher soul, with the world at large. And this is one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of meditation. I meditate an hour or two a day. I've been doing it for more than 10 years. And for people who need any tools about that, I would encourage you to visit sacredacoustics.com or to join our free webinars that we started in the COVID pandemic to help people deal with anxiety and depression in the midst of the challenges of the pandemic. And that's by going to unitedinhopeandhealing.com, which is a free set of webinars to help people come into this higher knowing of self and of their pathways forward, and certainly how meditation going within can be very powerful. But remember, all that does is help us grow into who we are, but the actual soul growth occurs with what we do in this lifetime. We must take action. We must be out there to help the least, the last, the lost, to defend refugees, to help people who are in trouble. That's what this world is about, is humanity helping humanity. We're all in this together, and that's where we gain tremendous strength. In fact, I think that's going to be one of the best gifts of the COVID pandemic. It's exposed some horrific problems in the kind of underpinnings of our society, especially, I can tell you, here in the United States, our horrible safety net for people with health care, economic polarization with far too much wealth at the very tip top. We need a far better economic distribution that still allows capitalism to flourish and yet allows a far more generous sharing of the benefits of the economy with all people. We're all here together. We need to take care of each other.
Thank you. Thank you. I can feel you when you're in that energy, or that soul energy, or whatever you want to call it, but there's just so much just you want to give. I really receive that. So thank you.
This is all about soul to soul connection. You're right. And the beautiful resonance of that kind of loving energy as it reverberates through that soul network kind of reminds me of that Indra's net that I saw deep in my coma journey, where all those interwoven threads of the different lifetimes of sentient beings led to this brilliant lit core, brighter than a million suns, of the kind of origin or Christ consciousness that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin talked about in his book, The Phenomenon of Man, back in the mid-20th century, which I think is a very important way of looking at true evolution of all consciousness, which I think that's what all this is the evolution of consciousness itself.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to ask you, just quickly going back to the soul thing, I wanted to ask you, in that heavenly realm, let's say, in the afterlife, there's no such thing as time, but there seems to be a chronology still, right? Because there's a chronology in that let me see if I can get this right. The God self wants to know itself better, so it fragments out into different carnations so that it can have those lessons reflected back to itself, so it kind of integrates, right? That would be my understanding of.
Well, in many ways, I think, yes, it's like an experiment that's being done by that God force in a process of kind of self-discovery. But it's also a passionate love for being that. I mean, that's how I could see that our very conscious awareness as a sentient being was directly sourced in that profound core of pure love of the universe, of the creator for the creation, essentially.
So but what I'm saying, there's still a chronology to it, even though it's a timeless state. There is still a process that's unfolding, and it's developing, shall we say, which I find interesting.
Very much the case, and you're making a good distinction there between what we see as Earth time. And again, that distinction is what allows for life reviews to be so comprehensive and so complete. But from my point of view, that notion of deep time, as I put it, which is a whole different ordering and causality, which is really what allows for the evolution of consciousness itself. If you read Teilhard de Chardin's book, Phenomenon of Man, you'll see what I'm talking about with this Christ consciousness and omega point. And it doesn't have to do with Christianity. It has much more to do with this God force of pure love and of coming together. I mean, they're basically Christian principles, but they're also there in all the major religions, basically have these notions of mercy and compassion and kindness and connection. Like we said earlier, the golden rule is written into all of them. That unconditional love is the crucial aspect of this. But the more we can demonstrate that here in this world, the more our souls and soul groups are actually growing towards that oneness with the divine.
Fantastic. And in that realm, would you say there is a hell, or is that only a heaven, if you like?
There's nothing sensical at all about an eternal hell and damnation. That has zero chance of actually fitting into any of this. I would say that our notions of hell have come from life reviews. If your life review occurs after you've handed out a lot of pain and suffering to others, wow, that's not going to be any fun, because a life review is all about kind of balancing. That is, receiving everything you've dished out. And if you've dished out a lot of good and love to people, your life review is going to be a lot more pleasant experience than if you've dished out a lot of pain and suffering. Because a life review in many ways is a kind of a great equalizer and teacher that kind of helps the soul to get on track towards this oneness with the divine. But all through realizing that we're sharing that one mind. We are all in this together. I mean, when you look at the evidence for telepathy, for instance, read that book by Guy Leon Playfair on twin telepathy. Amazing book, where basically 35% of identical twins have such profound telepathic experiences that one of them might touch a hot stove and the other twin 1,000 miles away will feel pain and develop a blister. I mean, these are kind of extraordinary events. So we're connected by mind. And there are many other examples in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. We talk about all this in great detail. And people who want to learn more can definitely go to ebenalexander.com, look at my recommended reading list and look through the blog postings. You'll find a tremendous amount of information about all of this.
Yeah, fantastic, Eben. I mean, I think you've signposted our audience to most of them. Is there anything else that they haven't we haven't signposted to? We've got your books, we've got your websites.
Yeah, I think two other places I'd like to help people find. One is GalileoCommission.org. That's a group based in Europe. They've done an incredible job. I'm one of the 100+ scientific advisors to that group. But go to GalileoCommission.org and you will learn a lot more about the scientific revolution that we're talking about here and now. The other thing is, again, reincarnation, absolutely essential. It's a cornerstone of any understanding of this. And to learn much more about that, go to uvadops.org. That's the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies.org. They've been working for more than 6 decades scientifically on the reality of afterlife, on the reality of reincarnation, more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children where reincarnation is the most reasonable explanation, and just extraordinary work. The scientific community is on the verge of a tremendous breakthrough in our understanding. In many ways, it simply mirrors what spiritual traditions, East and West, have known for thousands of years. But it's important for all of us to get back to our origins and kind of an understanding of the deep nature of reality. And it absolutely involves rejecting materialism or physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists, as ridiculous. Now, the only other thing is sacredacoustics.com. I said I've meditated hours daily for more than a decade. Sacredacoustics.com is a beautiful place to learn a lot more about that. And again, I would send people to unitedinhopeandhealing.com, a tremendous free resource to help people through the challenges and anxieties of the COVID pandemic and of the economic shutdown around it. There's a tremendous amount of stress. We really need to help each other in rebuilding this world.
Fantastic. I think that's a beautiful way to end our chat here. I'd just like to say, Eben, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for putting all your life experience into these books to inspire others and give other people a different perspective. I think, which is the biggest thing, right? That was the biggest gift you had, is to be able to share this with others and let them know there's something else, other truths out there, rather than just what we see within our very blinkered lives. And
I think we're all here to share these journeys. And
yeah.
From my point of view, Proof of Heaven was most important because it took the lid off for the medical profession, for the scientific community, and for the world at large, so that millions can share these stories. They're part of our shared destiny. And so they're very important to treat with the appropriate kind of respect and understanding that they deserve.
And just one last thing: are you now not fearful of death one bit? You're almost.
Death is an adventure. Death is an adventure. It's not to be feared at all. Now, the important thing to remember is we all have things to do in this world. This world is where we actually get our soul growth done.
Yeah.
We don't do it there. All that is, in the kind of afterlife and the between lives world, is to kind of help us reassess, recharge, reorient, through life reviews and soul group replanning. But this is where we get the work done. So I'm in no hurry to die. I still have a lot of living to do with the beautiful people and souls that I share on this world. But I can tell you, for example, I was with my own mother, who passed over about a year ago, April 10th of 2019. And for my sisters and I to be at her bedside, it was a beautiful gift. And I'd spent a lot of time talking with her about my experience. She had been there when I was ill. She'd been there at my bedside. She was 99 years old, and she was very excited about moving on to the next level. She knew without question she would be reuniting with her beloved Eben Jr., who had departed this world back in 2004. And she also knew very strongly the reality of reincarnation. We had discussed that before. And it's in many ways you can plan your next incarnations, even when a loved one is in the process of departing this world. Plan on that gathering, plan on the signals you'll use and the different ways you'll get back together and what you'd like to accomplish in that next life, because that's really who we are. Reincarnation is absolutely real. We are much grander as souls and soul groups than this puny little being that occupies a physical body for a few years. So embrace that journey.
We're infinitely more majestic and powerful
We
than
are
we
indeed.
could ever imagine. Yeah. So I'd just like to say, Eben, thank you so much for coming on Raising the Bar. Your story is fantastic and very inspiring to everyone that's I can imagine that's watching this. So thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for putting all your experiences into your books and your work. So,
thank you, John. It's been a real joy being here, and maybe we can talk again sometime. But
that'd be great.
Thank you for what you're doing in spreading this to the world.
Thank you so much. Yeah.